podcast.
Hey, well, welcome to the podcast. I'm Joel here with my dad,
Hi, ready to go.
my dad Rick. And last podcast, we talked about the idea of change, and it reminded me of a quote I heard many years ago. And it was this quote: "The only thing that will change you is the people you meet and the books you read." So we haven't given my dad much preparation on this, but I wanted him to talk about who is one person that's literally just changed the way he looks at things, and then what are some books that he's read throughout his life that have helped him. So I was going to start with one of the people that helped change the way I see things, and then that'll give you time to think about that, and then we'll talk about the books. And I've got some of my books stacked up here. I know everybody loves a good book
10
recommendation.
life-changing books.
Yeah. So did Arlo. So I think one of the biggest people, obviously you've had the most impact in my life, but I think one of the biggest people that helped me change the way I see, like fundamentally change the way I see the world, is Keith Lamb. Bible teacher, probably the best Bible teacher I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
Church in Kerrville, Texas, Grace Bible. And what he made me see was just how big God is. And I grew up we grew up a pastor's kid. It's not like you weren't, sometimes you just can't hear stuff that your own parents tell you. Sometimes you got to hear from somebody else. But I think my shift in the way I saw the world came with Keith when I was probably 18 or 19. And just the way he saw how God operated, the structure, the order of everything that God does, the purpose and intention behind it. He doesn't waste anything. It was a whole new revelation for me. It brought some order to kind of a bunch of disparate things I had learned growing up about God. But he's one that just fundamentally changed the way I see the world. Who you got, Dad?
Well, I would be, Keith the same way with me because, but it had to do with his way of looking at Scripture being covenant of God, and like everything, all Scripture applies to us, but it initially was written maybe for another purpose or written to the Jews and to begin to interpret it differently. So I would say the same way as far as Scripture goes. Another one who really impacted me was a pastor that he was a counseling pastor on the staff of First Church where your mom and I met, where you grew up, Faith Temple, Sam Kelly.
Yeah, you refer to him a lot.
Yeah, he really, and a lot of it is just he was a guy who believed in me. He was a counselor, but not by training. He was a pastoral type counselor. And I noticed, like, for instance, when your mom and I would be having a difficulty in our early years of marriage, we'd go in and counsel with him, or she'd go in and talk with him, and she'd come out, and everything was great. And when I was frustrated, I'd go in and talk with him, and I'd come out, and everything was great. And when I realized it, all he would do was he would just, when your mom would go in, he would just sit and listen, and he'd go, "You really have a great husband. He really loves God."
Yeah.
And he just started pointing out the positives. He did the same thing with me, but I'd go, "You really have a great wife." And you just come out and go, "Yeah, you're right." No psychology, no anything. He just kind of points you back to the right thing. And then his motto was, "Bless him, bless him, bless him." You go in and you say, "Somebody just stabbed me in the back, ran over my cat, and shot my oldest son. Bless him, bless him, bless him." Sometimes you didn't want to go talk to him because you knew what he was going to say.
Right. I don't need to go meet with him. I know what he's going to
I
say.
know what he's going to tell me. Bless him, bless him, bless him.
But you would say he helped fundamentally shape?
Yeah, he really did. I think a lot in just seeing that God's called us to bless and not curse. And so whatever comes your way, just be a person of blessing, be an instrument of blessing, be an instrument of forgiveness. And I saw that a lot in his life, and he taught that and he lived it, and he was just one of those kind and gentle guys.
Yeah.
And so I would say he and as you say, Keith, as far as theology and understanding of God, Keith probably greater than anybody else.
Yeah.
I remember an instance I had when I was in the military. This is just like one situation, but I worked for a first-class petty officer. And I was complaining because I had to work late 2 or 3 nights in a row, and stuff. And he'd been there with me. And I came in the next day and I was just grumbling about how, man, I haven't any time off or anything, And he just looked at me and says, I was there with you at those over hours and I haven't got any time off either. And all of a sudden, that's all he said. But all of a sudden I realized, oh my gosh, I just look at the world from how it affects me. I have never paid attention, like 19, 20 years old, I realized, I've never paid attention to what's happening in other people's lives while something's happening to me.
Yeah.
And it was just that was just like one of those, wow, I need to open my eyes and look at how things are going on and affect those around me.
Some guy that didn't have long-term, like ongoing impact. That's an interesting thing.
No, just a one time.
I was thinking about that the other day. when we went on a trip recently, Elise cut her little hand it was a car seat we were renting or something. And for like the next 3 days, she was holding her finger like this, and she wouldn't let anybody touch it. We couldn't even put a Band-Aid on it. And we're like, Elise, get your hand off. Let us put a Band-Aid on it. She's, no, 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 no. And we're walking down this trail, and some lady walks up to her. She's like, why are you holding your hand, sweetie? And I got hurt. And the lady's like, oh, let me look at your hand. She takes it, cleans it up, puts a band. We're like blown away that this random lady is able to do this. And it just spoke to me that you just never know when you're going to be a voice of insight or healing to someone in their life that could change it. Like that one guy.
Yeah.
It's just a fascinating thing to me that when it hits you at the right time.
Right.
Like for her, none of us, there were 4 or 5 of us trying to get her to let her put a Band-Aid on her finger. She would not do it. And that one lady's like, hey, sweetie, cleans it up, puts a Band-Aid on, and then she's fine.
Stranger on the trail.
Yeah, and I just think how many times you just never know when you get to be that voice of healing or life or perspective change for somebody in somebody's life. You just don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So let your words be seasoned with salt.
Yes.
Healing, helpful.
So the beautiful thing I think about books is that you get access to people you may never get to meet one-on-one.
Right.
And I remember the first book I ever really read and took seriously was when I was about 17. I don't know why you gave me this book, but you're like, you need to read this book. It was How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie.
Yeah.
And I read the book, and I remember that day, we were in Guatemala, and I remember there's like a thing on smiling. And I was like, I'm just going to try this. So I smiled. I went down to the pizza place, and while I was there at the pizza place, just smiling, they're giving me all this free stuff, and I'm like, oh, this stuff really works. So I kept reading the book. And I was like, yes. And the thing about the book, I've heard people dog on the book, say, oh, it's learning how to manipulate people. It's really not.
It's not.
It's really learning how to care for other people and speak in terms that they understand. And when you care about them. But that got me kind of on the path to reading. Now, I wasn't much of a reader because in school, I hated reading because there's assignments around it. And I don't like assignments around my reading. Even to this day, if I'm assigned a book, I'm like, So even in college, I hated reading books that they assigned me. I wanted to read what I wanted to read.
Yeah.
But I started reading, and I was going to go over a couple of books that really shifted me. One of them was this Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline. And I actually wrote about how much this impacted me in the book Fully You. I happened to get this book while I was on a trip in China, and it just hit me at just the right time when I'd finally gotten out of college, and I'd been working full-time, going to school full-time, and for the first time I realized what slowing down looked like. And I read this book, and it talks about some of the spiritual disciplines that God helps use to free you from kind of the old shame-based self that you have. So this book was a major game changer for me. I remember years earlier, my friend got this at a bookstore, and I was like, Celebration of Discipline? Who wants to read a book about discipline?
Celebrating it.
But it was a game changer for me. And what's interesting is also on that China trip, I stumbled there was a library at the missionary place, a book called Disappointment with God, which you had recommended before.
Yeah, it's an amazing book.
It's a book by Philip Yancey where he talks about Job. And Job's every right, Job had to be disappointed with God because he was basically a victim of a cosmic wager. But yet he doesn't curse God, right? And in the end, God actually is pretty happy with Job, but he's not happy with Job's friends who have come up with easy answers. And I started thinking, anyways, this book really impacted me during that time. Disappointment with God, The 3 Questions No One Asks Aloud. Another book that I just constantly go back to, I usually read it every year. 2 of them I read every year. One is M. Scott Peck's The Road Less Traveled. It's just, to me, the ultimate. Another book actually about discipline, interesting enough. He says, discipline is the way we solve life's problems, which is... It's a fascinating book. Everybody I've ever recommended this book to, they're like, wow. I would say this book, probably more than any book, changed my life up until just last year when I read another book that changed my life even more, which I'll go to that in a second. But The Road Less Traveled, he talks about just the different things that we need to master. One of them is openness to challenge, total willingness to face the truth, delaying of gratification, just disciplines that I think we all think we all know we need them, but we just don't pursue them. But that was one that really impacted me. Love G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. I've never seen somebody who's so flippant about really serious things and lighthearted, but yet so deep and profound. And I read this one every year. I go back to Orthodoxy just because there's so much. I love one of his things about courage. He says courage is almost a contradiction in terms. willingness to die combined with with a desire to live. Like the guy that's fighting his way out of a crowd of surrounded by soldiers he wants to live so bad that he's willing to fight it for it. And it's funny, every time I end up quoting Chesterton all the time because he's just a brilliant dude. He was an influence on C.S. Lewis, and I love him. And then the other one is this book. It's totally, you got Chesterton, the classic, perennial classic, and then you got another one by Phil Vischer, the creator of VeggieTales, and he wrote a book called Me, Myself, and Bob that I loved because as a visionary, you get frustrated and stuff. And here's the story of a guy who he reached the peak with VeggieTales, and then everything came crumbling down. And one of the quotes that I love from here is he says, he quoted actually a pastor said something to him while he was struggling with the loss of his whole company. It's a crazy story of the demise of VeggieTales. There's a bunch of lessons in there for leaders and visionaries. But he says, if God gives you a dream and the dream comes to life and God shows up in it, and then the dream dies, it may be that God wants to see what is more important to you, the dream or him. And I thought, man, that is just like the crux of it as we're striving and dreaming about what God wants to do through us, but he doesn't really care. I mean, that's what I get from it. Like, he doesn't care what you do, he cares who you become.
Yeah.
And that was just a huge reminder from it, from a guy who reached the peak of success. I mean, what did you dream of? And then he lost it all almost overnight. Great book. So those are some of the ones that impacted me. And then more recently, like I said, Road Less Traveled was probably my favorite book for the last 10, 12 years. And then last year I read Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And that just hit me. I read it 3 times last year. I'm reading it in French right now. Just because it's so, well, first of all, incredibly profound, but just the real life practicality of some of the stages of life that I'm in and what he talks about and like one of the things that changed me was him talking about how in our 20s, before we really even know ourselves, we set these arbitrary goals for ourselves, and we make, I've got to do this by this age, and this by that age, and this. And I had set a lot of those. I said, before I'm 40, I'm going to do that. Well, I turned 40 2 years ago, and a lot of them hadn't happened. And you get angry and frustrated with yourself. But he points out in the book, he says, you don't even know who you are in your 20s, and not every variable is in place in your 20s. For example, wasn't married when I made those goals. Didn't have a mortgage when I made those goals. Yeah. Didn't have a daughter when I made those goals. And so we become tyrants with ourselves when we're trying to reach a goal and that we've just set arbitrarily based on something we decided in our 20s we needed. And we become so tyrannical with ourselves. We get down on ourselves, resentful, angry at ourselves, angry at the reality of the world. But the reality is you just didn't have a really realistic take on what the world's like. And that opened my mind to so many things. And then him just talking about taking responsibility for what you can change, what you can't. Aim lower, that one just blew my mind because nobody ever tells you to aim lower. But he says, if you feel like you can't change things, keep aiming lower until you find what you can change.
What you can.
And then change that. And then just see what happens. And then there's usually something else you can change, but you just keep aiming lower. And I'm just such a big, high-picture thinker. I'm always like, I got to get there. That I feel like any small step I make here, incremental step, is not significant. And that book just changed my life. The guy's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, I think he's just a modern C.S. Lewis type character. Brilliant dude. Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start off there because that one has really impacted me too, I think in totally different areas. I was sharing with you earlier, one of the little phrases that really caught me was the thing where he said, consult with your resentments. Mm-hmm. In other words, listen to your resentments. And I kind of looked at it like your resentments will be these counselors that will reveal things to you. And I don't seem, I'm not a terribly resentful person, but when he started thinking of that, I thought, well, and then he gave some examples, and I thought, well, there are some things I kind of, a little ticked off with. And by my nature, I tend to just, put them down. It's not a big deal. Deal with it, grow up.
That Enneagram 9 that's like, we're not going to let that impact me.
Yeah, and the Enneagram too. That's the other book that I just recently read. That when I read that, and I found out, yes, Karis, my daughter, was telling me, you're a 9. So I said, well, maybe I'll figure out what a 9 is and tell her how wrong she is. And I read it and I realized, wow, that pretty well describes me. I don't know where they get the research or anything on this. It's ancient, so therefore it's got to be true.
We don't know where it came from.
Some desert father dug it up in the...
Or maybe an alien.
Yeah, who knows? But anyway, so it must be right since it's ancient. Yeah. But I read the 9 and I realized, man, that explains why these resentments that's why that statement was so powerful to me. And what he says, of course, is when you have resentments, one of two things is going on. Either injustice is afoot, and you need to do something about it.
Tyranny is afoot,
Tyranny
he
is
says,
afoot.
yes.
That's it. Yes, tyranny is afoot. You need to do something about it, or you just need to grow up. You're being a big baby about it.
Suck
you
it
know?
up. Yeah.
Yep. So as I began to kind of check on my resentments, I thought, I do resent that. That's kind of that bothers me.
And he says if tyranny is afoot, it's your responsibility to express it.
You need to do something about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
If there's something really is going wrong, so you either do something or shut up and grow up.
Yeah.
And I've ran into both. I've realized, well, that really bothers me. Well, yeah, just shut up and grow up. Be an adult. You
Yeah.
know.
This is part of it. Yeah.
You're 65. It's about time you grow up. You know. Or it's about time you say something about it. And but you see, by my nature, I'm like, I don't want to say anything because it's going to cause a bunch of waves. And I just don't want to deal with the repercussions of it,
Yeah.
you know. And it's
How
just
did I
like,
come from you? Because I'm like,
you must be more like your mother.
I'll say something if it slightly bothers me.
Yeah, I don't know.
Emily's more like you. She's like, why'd you have to say that? I'm like, somebody needed to know.
And I kind of like, it's not going to change anyway. Why suffer
I guess so.
why suffer the tsunami of the wave coming over when it's just going to all go back out to the ocean anyway? But anyway, I'm learning to kind of, I do need to say something. There is some benefit to it. So those two books actually in tandem, it was kind of interesting.
So that the Enneagram one is the Ian Morgan Crone Road Back to You one, right?
Road Back
Yeah.
to You. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's
It's
interesting.
the big rage right now.
Yeah, apparently so.
Enneagram is. I read it. Maybe we'll get somebody on to talk about the Enneagram. I'm an 8.
Yeah.
Which actually kind of fits, but yeah.
Which is kind of weird because you think 1, 2, 3, 4, it should like be sort of sequential, right? So an 8 should be just a little different than a 9.
Yeah, but
they're
we're
like,
total opposites.
they're like totally opposite. So I don't know where they came up with this
Yeah.
system, but he explained it the first. But just it's ancient, so
Yeah.
don't question.
So those are two modern
Those are
books,
two.
but I know that there's other books that are like,
Yeah, a lot of that have. In fact, it's funny. You mentioned that when you first got hired with Southwest Airlines, they gave out a book, and I thought you were going to mention the first one called "Still Nuts." After all these years, you got hired the 25th year, and somebody wrote a book on the founder's philosophy. What's his name?
Herb Kelleher.
Herb Kelleher.
I got to have some great lunches with him.
Yeah, and it was the most amazing book. I just tore through that, and I thought, this is a book pastors ought to read, because he had some of the things, like one of the things I remember he was saying is that people say the customer's always right. He said, the customer's not always right. I hire quality people. My people are usually right. And if you treat my people wrong, I'm not going to let you fly my airline. And I thought, if we were loyal enough to other brothers and sisters that way, and particularly as a pastor with his staff, hey, if a congregation member's chewing up on the staff, look, I hire good staff. If they're wrong, I'll rebuke them. But if they're not, you need to leave my people alone.
Wow.
Just loyalty like that to the people you work with.
Yeah.
And this is a guy in a secular company, a secular business, and there were many other principles of leadership that I thought, wow, these are just godly principles. There's an ungodly man who has somehow stumbled upon, well, it's much like the winning friends and influence people. It's just biblical principles applied in a business setting. And somehow he stumbled across those, and that's why Southwest Airlines was such a flaming success, because he was following biblical principles. And principles work whether you're a believer or not. So that was one that's kind of funny.
So I think was it called Nuts, or was it called
Still Nuts after all these years.
Okay,
I think it was just big nuts,
and
but
that's
Still
based
Nuts.
on the idea that they just used to serve nuts on all their flights.
They were the first airline that
Yeah.
served peanuts.
Which
yeah.
now serving nuts on flights is a new novel concept again.
Yeah, well, you can't do it now because somebody in the back row is going to be allergic and
that's
they're going
true.
to cough up
That's
and
true.
die
I
or
was gonna say,
something.
just for serving anything for a while was a big deal on an airplane.
Yeah,
Now they're like,
now they're back to nuts.
oh, we better give them something.
Pretzels.
Yeah.
It's pretzels.
Pretzels, yeah.
Who likes pretzels? I don't like.
Gluten-free
Anyway,
pretzels, right?
yeah, probably. So those are some, and then some older books that really influenced me too. I think of one's a kind of a novel, I guess, Peace Child, remember, by Don Richardson, and that is an amazing book on. It's an actual story of Don Richardson as a missionary reaching this tribe, but the discovery he made in it was that in the heart of every people group, in every culture, there are things in that culture that reflect the nature of God, and there are things that reflect the nature of the enemy, the evil one. And in every culture, God has deposited a key to the heart of that culture. And the reason that was so powerful is I began to, it just, again, shows the bigness of God, that from the very start, he was concerned about every culture and reaching that culture. And so he deposited keys into that culture. And then he wrote a follow-up book to it called Eternity in Their Hearts.
So Peace Child was before Eternity?
Yeah.
That book made an impact on me too. I remember reading that book. I read Eternity in Their Hearts before Peace Child. I didn't realize it was a follow-up.
Yeah. Because he determined that. All of a sudden, he found this key. He couldn't find any way to reach this culture. And all of a sudden, this accidentally, you might say, came across this key in Peace Child. The Peace Child was the key to the culture.
Yeah,
Won't
yeah.
spoil the story. But then he began to realize, well, if God has done this for these people, maybe he's done it in other cultures. And he goes back and he searches. So it's not just a missions book. I mean, it's a fascinating. I mean, you just can't put the book down, The Peace Child. It's an amazing, amazing story.
It'll mess with, if you've got a very small kind of theology of God, it'll mess with it though, because, you know, the idea that, well, you've got to hear Jesus' name, you got to call him Jesus, and
Yeah.
it's like, well, there's some interesting stories around the world of people who had understandings of who the concepts of God and Jesus and redemption, who
Yeah.
they didn't even know who the guy was that they were worshiping at the time.
But yeah, oh, so that's his name.
Yeah.
That's, oh, okay. Well, now we know who he is, you know. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's amazing. And again, it just expands your concept of, wow, God's a whole lot bigger than my little, okay, come forward, pray this prayer, you know, don't smoke, don't chew, don't go with girls that
Yeah.
do, and, you know, read the Bible now and then, you know.
Yeah.
God is so much bigger. So he is. Let's see, a couple others. Briefly, there's another one out that's kind of hot right now called Atomic Habits. And I remember that something you said touched upon that, because it's just the idea of we kind of feel like, oh, my life is so messed up and I've got to change all these things, and so you just get overwhelmed and not really. The idea is an atom is small, but an atom has a lot of power, and so if you'll just change a little bit at a time, that little bit, a little bit today, a little bit tomorrow, and over time, it's like savings. You put a penny away today and 2 pennies tomorrow, and you know, in a year you have $3.65. No.
But I love what he talks about in there is he says if a plane starts out in L.A. going to New York, but is 3 degrees off, they end up in Washington, D.C. Because by the time it's extended out over the length of the country, I love that analogy he uses.
Yeah, so a little bit of changes they not overwhelm you, but I can do that, and then I just do it again, and I just do it again. And you can then eventually big changes come out of that. So a couple other books, and these are like oldies, but I'm sure they're still out there. One that had really impacted me when I was a young believer. One is called Freedom of Forgiveness, and it was the first time that I began to understand what forgiveness is all about. And as you kind of know, that has kind of become a life message of mine.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
But to realize that forgiveness is not a feeling, but it is a decision that you make, much like love is not a feeling, but it's a decision that I make. And then based upon taking love as the example, based upon the fact that I decide to love, then I begin to behave lovingly. And that's not hypocritical. I don't feel like it. Well, you just do what's right, and the feelings fall in line. And if they don't, they don't. You're still doing what's right. And forgiveness is the same way. It's a decision you make. I choose to forgive that person. Now, you may still feel the pain, you may feel the hurt, you may even feel the anger, you may feel all that inside, but you make that decision, and then you allow your feelings to get in line with the decision that you've made. And there's a lot of psychology and research out there that shows that your emotions will come in line with the decisions that you make.
Right.
It's a whole lot easier to to behave your way into feeling right than to feel your way into behaving right.
Yeah, you won't feel your way into changing, but you can change your way
So
into
you just
feeling.
behave right, and so that helps me a lot with forgiveness. And these all kind of hit me at the same time. The other one then was a book by a guy named Charles Solomon called The Ins and Out of Rejection. And I remember this fellow I talked about earlier, Sam Kelly, he would tell me, he says, you're dealing with rejection in your life, and a lot of the problems you have are because of the rejection you feel in your life. And I thought, I don't feel rejection. He says, you had your father abandon you when you were a child. And I go, yeah, well, I don't feel rejection over it. Because I had this picture of rejection like it was this little puppy, that you scold the puppy and he puts his little tail between his legs and he runs off and hides, and I thought, I don't feel that way.
Right.
And so I'm not suffering with rejection. But as I began to read the ins and out, there's lots of ways in, only one way out of rejection.
Oh, that's what I call that. Okay.
That's why it's the ins and the out, not the outs. And he said that there's several types of responses to rejection, but one of them was, and he says, if you ever say this, it's probably a sign that you're dealing with rejection. It's like, well, who needs them anyway? He said, that's the, I will reject you before you can reject me. And man, when he said that, I don't know how many times and how many people I had said that about. Well, who needs them anyway? Who cares what they think anyway? Because it's you rejecting them before they can reject you, and it's you're putting up your guards because you're expecting to be rejected.
Right.
And all of a sudden I had to say, okay, I need to listen to this guy. He nailed me.
Yeah.
And I began to realize, yeah, that was something I was dealing with, and saw how it was how it was affecting my relationships, how I was putting up barriers to keep people out. You know the old Paul Simon song? No, you probably don't. I am a rock, I am an island.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. I mean,
good.
that was written. Oh man, that is a masterful poem put to music. You know, I have my books and my poetry to protect me. I'm shielded, safe within my armor, secure and within my womb. You know, it's a deep and dark rejection and all that. But I'm a rock. I'm an island. And I realized, wow, that is exactly what I was. I had built these barriers to keep me. And you can do that, and so many people live their life like that. But it's such a lonely existence. And again, that song so portrays the sadness of it.
Yeah.
And so that book really helped me, because then he talked about how you confess and you open up, and the way out is to just open your heart and know you're going to be hurt, but you know you're going to be rejected.
Isn't it interesting that a lot of the books that I read all happen in the same season that changed me, and it's like it seems like maybe God does that. He opens up windows of receptivity to a certain
Yeah,
message. Because I mean, I'm thinking 4 of these were read during that time I was in China,
yeah.
and it was just
Well,
one thing built on the other, on the other, on the other.
it's because you're going through a real dark time too. And
Yeah, that's true.
you don't want to, I mean, hate to use cliches, but as they say, the fruit grows in the valley.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, of course, in Guatemala, it grows on the mountainsides too, but the valleys are more fruitful. And I've found my greatest growth takes place in those really dark times.
It's when you're more receptive, probably, to.
Yeah, desperate.
Yeah.
Desperation really helps. Two others.
Okay.
Two others that really, and these are books. When I was going to Guatemala, I realized we could only take about 10 books with me. I loaded these two, and they're really light, but I took them. One is called, and these are amazing. The one is called "Will the Real Heretic Please Stand Up?"
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the other one by the same guy is called "We Don't Speak Great Things, We Live Them." And they both examine, the first one, Real Heretic, examines the beliefs of the early church on certain topics that are relevant to today. You know, what did the early church teach on abortion? Because they had taught teachings on abortion. What did the early church teach on homosexuality? And just different topics that are really pertinent today. What did they teach? And it was mind-boggling. And the idea behind it is all of us, no matter how conservative we might think we are, how biblical we think we are, compared to the early church, we're going to find areas where we're probably heretics. We're really out of sync with what the early church taught. Now, this is the first 300 years. And beyond that, he says, well, then the church changed so dramatically with Constantine and all that you can't really go. But in the first 300 years, the writers and what the disciples of the disciples taught. And all of a sudden I realized, I guess it too kind of opened my mind to, okay, I don't have this nailed down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't have this theology, I know exactly what, the way you do it and all that. And then the other one, the idea of we don't speak great things, we live them. The title of that, it's a two-part book. And the title of that comes from a Roman who was attacking the Christians and saying, you guys, you dress funny, you speak funny, you don't participate in our, you don't have great philosophers like we do. We have Plato and we have this and we have that and we have these great philosophers. And the Christian's response was, we don't speak great things, we live them. Mm. And you couldn't argue with the love that the church had and with their care for others and all of that. So those two books really challenged me theologically, and I go back, I carried those with me because I thought I need to be reminded. Just takes you back to the early church, and you realize, wow, we're so far. We're so far from biblical standards.
We've all got our own heresies, right?
Yeah, I don't even know why God puts up with any of us, really, because we're all so far off.
Speaking of God putting up with us, it reminded me of one more book that I think has both been impactful for both of us, which is A Tale of Three Kings by Gene Edwards.
Yeah.
I recommend that to anybody
Yeah.
who is ever planning to set foot in a church. If you're ever planning to set foot in a church and interact with people, you need to read A Tale of Three Kings. It's a story of David, or Saul first, then David,
And Absalom.
and Absalom, and
Yeah.
basically the way that all of them responded to authority in their life, and how tricky it can be sometimes when you're trying to follow somebody in authority that you just
Somebody's
don't.
abusive.
Somebody's abusive, or you don't respect them, you don't understand how God could have given them that authority, and what do you do, and how do you respond in a godly way? So I think that's a tremendous book for everybody to read. Andy Stanley quoted that it helped him during a really challenging time in his life.
Yeah, if you've ever been
Yeah.
hurt by the church, first of all, take a number. We all have been.
Yeah.
If you've been in the church long, you've been hurt. But second of all, yeah, that book will help you deal with how do you deal with being hurt?
Yeah.
Because here David was, he's serving under a crazy king, literally demon possessed, and yet he's still the leader. And that's an amazing book.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, I would encourage you, if you do say, hey, I'm not a reader, which I hear that all the time, on a lot of it's because I feel weird when I read. I don't know how to read well. Listen,
Yeah.
You don't have any excuse anymore, man. You've got Audible. You've got apps like the library app where you can listen to the books. And then the other thing is, find people you admire and ask them what they're reading.
Yeah.
Because like a lot of the stuff that I read here was references from other people. But reading, there's nothing that'll change you like the people you meet and the books that you read. And the books you read are such a tremendous thing because you can take them home with you. But you can't always take the people you meet home with you.
Yeah.
But with the books, you can.
Well, too, it's kind of like a restaurant. If you go into McDonald's, like hamburgers, you'll go to a fish place, or go somewhere else,
Yeah.
So if you get into a book and it's like, oh, well, this is really boring or whatever, well, put it down and go get another one.
Try something else.
If you liked what you heard, please consider sharing this with a friend. For more information, visit joelmalm.com or rickmalm.com. Thanks for listening.